The cold was a thief. It stole the feeling from her fingertips as she gripped the splintered wood of the windowsill. It stole the breath from her lungs in a white puff of mist. Most of all, it stole her hope, leaving behind the hard, brittle certainty of her own worthlessness. Ilara had lived with that certainty for all of her 19 years. Her father, the beta of the Northern Ridge Pack, had made sure of it. A daughter born with legs that would not hold her was not a daughter at all. She was a shame, a stone tied to the family name, dragging it down into the mud. So he had sent her here, to this forgotten cabin at the edge of their territory, with just enough rations to be considered care, and just enough distance to be considered an exile. Her wheelchair was her cage, and her only freedom. Its crude wooden wheels groaned in protest as she maneuvered around the single cramped room. The floorboards were uneven, a constant challenge. Everything was a challenge. Fetching water, stoking the meager fire, mending her own thin clothes. Each task was a mountain she had to climb, and every night she went to sleep with the aching exhaustion of a failed conqueror. Today, the cold was sharper, armed with a wind that clawed at the chinking in the log walls. A storm was coming. Not just any storm, but the one that always seemed to accompany the great hunt. It was the one time of year the entire pack felt a tremor of fear and awe, for the hunt was led by the Alpha King himself, King Kalen. She had never seen him. No one in this remote outpost had. He was a creature of legend, a ghost of winter who ruled from a distant frozen citadel. They said he was ancient, that his heart was made of ice, that he had never taken a mate because no female was strong enough to withstand his chilling presence. They said his eyes were the color of a winter sky just before a blizzard. A violent gust of wind slammed against the cabin, and the shutter on the small window tore loose from its leather hinge. It banged against the wall with the rhythm of a frantic heartbeat. If it broke the glass, the cold would have her before morning. Panic, cold and sharp as the wind itself, lanced through her. She wheeled herself to the door, her knuckles white on the push rims. The wind tore the heavy door from her grasp, slamming it open. Snow and ice swirled into the room, extinguishing the few candles she had lit. She had to get outside. She had to secure the shutter. With a grunt of effort, she pushed the chair over the threshold and into the rising snow. The wind was a physical blow, staggering the chair. Her cloak was useless against it. She reached for the banging shutter, her fingers numb and clumsy. She missed. The chair, caught by a brutal gust on the uneven ground, tilted. Time slowed. She felt the sickening lurch, the loss of balance. There was a moment of weightlessness, and then she was falling. She landed hard in a drift of snow and half-frozen mud. The impact jarred every bone in her body. Pain screamed up her spine. Her wheelchair lay on its side just beyond her reach. One wheel spinning uselessly in the wind. She was helpless. The cold was no longer a thief. It was a predator. It sank its teeth into her. A deep, paralytic venom. Her thin dress was soaked. The mud was an icy cage around her hips and useless legs. She tried to drag herself towards the chair, her fingers clawing at the frozen earth, but she had no leverage, no strength. Paragraph dash, paragraph. She could see her breath misting in front of her face, each cloud a little smaller than the last. This was how it ended. Not in a soft bed, but alone in the mud, frozen like an animal caught in a trap. A worthless girl, a broken thing, finally discarded for good. Her father would be relieved. She closed her eyes, a single frozen tear tracing a path down her cheek. The howling of the wind began to sound like a lullaby. Then a new sound cut through the storm, the crunch of heavy boots on snow. It was close. Too close. A poacher, perhaps? Or a wolf from a rival pack drawn by the storm? Fear gave her a momentary surge of adrenaline. She tried to call out, but her throat was a frozen knot. A shadow fell over her. It was immense, blocking out what little gray light the storm offered. She forced her eyes open and looked up into a face that seemed carved from the glacier itself. Sharp, predatory lines, a jaw that could cut stone, and eyes. The legends were wrong. They weren't the color of a winter sky. They were the color of ice, clear and fathomless, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that burned. It was him, the Alpha King. He was not supposed to be here. He was supposed to be miles away, leading the glorious hunt with the pack's strongest warriors. He was not supposed to be in this forgotten corner of his domain, standing over a crippled girl dying in the mud. Behind him, other figures emerged from the swirling snow, his elite guard, their faces a mixture of confusion and shock. They stopped several paces back, as if held by an invisible wall. The king took another step, his focus entirely, terrifyingly on her. He crouched down, his massive frame folding with a surprising grace. The wind seemed to quiet in his presence, the blizzard holding its breath. He reached out a hand, not to his guards, not to his weapon, but to her. His fingers, wrapped in black leather, brushed a strand of wet hair from her face. His touch was a shock. It wasn't warm, it was cold. Colder than the snow, colder than the wind. It was a deep, penetrating cold, like touching a stone pulled from the heart of a frozen river. Yet, there was no malice in it. It was just him. "You are freezing," he said. His voice was not the thunder she had imagined. It was deep, yes, but quiet. A low rumble that vibrated in her very bones. She couldn't answer. Her teeth were chattering too hard. He saw the overturned wheelchair, her desperate, clawed tracks in the mud. His impossibly cold eyes softened for a barest fraction of a second. It was a change so subtle she thought she might have imagined it. Without another word, he slid one arm beneath her shoulders and the other under her knees. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing at all. He cradled her against his broad chest, his fur-lined cloak wrapping around her. It was a strange paradox. His body was a wall of solid muscle, the kind of body that should radiate heat like a furnace. But the chill clung to him, a permanent aura of winter. And yet, tucked against him, shielded from the wind, the biting cold began to recede. It was his cold replacing the storms. It was less savage, more profound. He started walking, carrying her away from the broken cabin and back towards the pack settlement. His guards fell into step behind him, their silence a testament to their utter bewilderment. The Alpha King did not concern himself with omegas. He certainly did not rescue broken girls from snowdrifts. Alara rested her head against his chest. Through the thick layers of leather and fur, she thought she could feel a heartbeat. Slow, terribly slow, like a slumbering bear in the dead of winter. She was terrified, but beneath the terror, something else stirred. A flicker of warmth in her own chest. A tiny, defiant ember she hadn't felt in years. As they reached the edge of the settlement, figures rushed out to meet them. She saw her father's face, his jaw tight with fury, quickly replaced by stark, incredulous fear as he saw who carried her. He opened his mouth to speak, but the king's icy gaze silenced him before a single word could escape. The king did not stop. He walked past her father, past the gawking pack members, and straight towards the main lodge, the Alpha's house. He was taking her into the heart of the world that had cast her out, and no one dared to question why. The guest chambers in the pack lodge were a place of myth to Alara. She had only heard whispers of them, of rooms with roaring fires, soft beds, and glass in every window. Kaelin carried her into the finest of them and gently placed her on a bed piled high with wolf pelts. The warmth from the hearth was a blissful shock, coaxing the feeling back into her limbs with 1,000 painful needles. The pack's healer, an old woman named Lyra, bustled in, her face etched with worry. "Your Majesty, allow me." "Leave!" Kalen commanded, his voice soft but absolute. Lyra froze, then bowed her head and retreated, closing the heavy oak door behind her. They were alone. Alara watched, her heart hammering against her ribs as the most powerful man in the world knelt before her. He carefully began to unlace her frozen, mud-caked boots. His movements were methodical, precise. His cold fingers brushed against her skin, and that strange, contradictory feeling returned. A deep chill that somehow chased away the more painful cold of the storm. He worked in silence, removing her wet cloak and boots, wrapping her shivering body in the thickest, softest fur blanket she had ever touched. He moved to her legs, his expression unreadable as he looked at them. They were pale and thin, marked by years of disuse. She felt a hot flush of shame, the deepest humiliation of her life. She tried to pull the blanket over them, to hide her brokenness from his sight. He stilled her hand with his own. "Do not," he murmured. His thumb brushed over her ankle. His touch was clinical, yet strangely intimate. It wasn't pity she saw in his eyes. It was assessment, a deep, searching curiosity. When he was done, he stood and moved to the fire, stoking it until it blazed with renewed life. He turned back to her, his massive form silhouetted against the flames. "You will return to the capital with me," he stated. It wasn't a question or an offer, it was a decree. Alara found her voice, though it was a raw, shaky whisper. "Why?" His gaze was impenetrable. "I have my reasons." Before she could ask more, the door opened and her father stood there, his face a mask of controlled rage. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice strained. "This is a mistake. My daughter, she is unwell. She cannot travel. She is a burden." Kalen didn't even turn his head fully. He simply let his icy gaze slide over to the beta. "Your daughter is under my protection now, Fenris. Her health is my concern. You will prepare for our departure." "But sire," Fenris pressed, taking a half step into the room. "She is nothing. A cripple. An omen of bad luck. The pack has whispered it for years. She will bring ruin." In a movement so fast it was a blur, Kalen crossed the room and stood before Fenris. He was a full head taller, a predator facing a scavenger. "She," Kalen said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper that sliced through the air, "is worth more than your entire bloodline. You will not speak to her again. You will not look at her again. Do you understand me?" Fenris paled, his bravado crumbling into dust. He nodded jerkily, unable to speak. "Get out," Kalen breathed. Fenris practically fled the room. The king turned back to Alara. The fury in his eyes was gone, replaced by that unnerving, glacial calm. He walked to the side of the bed. "This is not what you think," he said, as if sensing the wild hope and confusion warring inside her. "I require your presence, nothing more. You will be safe, you will be warm, but you will keep to your own chambers. This is an arrangement for my benefit, not yours." The words were a slap, meant to extinguish any foolish ideas she might have, and yet they did the opposite. An arrangement for his benefit? What benefit could she, a broken Omega, possibly offer a king? The mystery of him deepened, and for the first time, the flicker of warmth in her chest felt less like an ember and more like a flame. The journey to his citadel was a blur of snow and speed. She was carried in a covered sleigh, wrapped in furs, while he rode alongside on a massive black charger that seemed as much a creature of winter as its master. His castle was a spike of black granite thrusting into the sky, a fortress against the world. It was magnificent and terrifying, and it was cold. A deep, permanent chill seemed to emanate from the very stones. The servants moved with silent efficiency, their eyes downcast, their faces pale. They feared their king. Everyone did. Alara was given a suite of rooms that were larger than her entire cabin. A fire was always burning, but it never seemed to quite chase the chill from the air. A new wheelchair, light and articulated, made of dark wood and polished steel, was waiting for her. A gift, one of the maids whispered, from the king himself. He kept his word. She was left alone. But every night, without fail, he would come. He would enter her chambers without a word, a silent, brooding presence. Sometimes he would bring her a book from his library, sometimes a tray with hot broth. Most nights he would simply stand by the fire, staring into the flames, his back to her. They rarely spoke. But in the silence, an intimacy grew. She began to read his moods from the set of his shoulders, from the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. She saw the exhaustion behind the iron control, the profound loneliness in his solitary vigil. Paragraph. She started to see past the mask of the cold king. She saw a man carrying a burden so heavy it was slowly crushing him. A strange, fierce protectiveness began to grow in her heart. One evening he brought a map, spreading it out on the table near her chair. It depicted the vast, sprawling territories of the north. "My father conquered these lands," he said, his voice a low murmur. "He burned them into submission." He traced a line with one cold finger. He believed power was fire. He was wrong. Power is ice. It preserves, it endures, but it also isolates. It was the most he had ever revealed about himself. She looked from the map to his face. "Is that why you are always cold?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. His gaze met hers. For a moment she saw something raw and unguarded in their icy depths, a flash of pain so intense it stole her breath. "The winter is not in the castle, Alara," he said softly. "It is in my blood." He folded the map and left without another word, but his confession hung in the air, a shared secret that bound them closer than any conversation. The warmth in her chest flared, a persistent heat that grew stronger every time he was near. It was a warmth she was beginning to crave, a warmth she was beginning to realize he might need even more than she did. Weeks turned into a month. The quiet rhythm of their nights became the anchor of Alara's new life. She read the books he brought, her mind, starved for years, devouring history, poetry, and tales of old magic. She started to speak more, asking questions about the books, about the world outside the castle walls. He answered her in his low, quiet way, his initial brevity giving way to longer explanations. She was changing. The perpetual fear that had been her companion for so long was receding, replaced by a tentative confidence. The servants no longer saw her as a strange curiosity. They saw her as the king's chosen, treating her with a deferential respect that both unnerved and empowered her. She was no longer Alara the cripple. In this cold, silent castle, she was simply Alara. He was changing too. The rigid line of his shoulders seemed to soften when he was in her chambers. The visits grew longer. He would sometimes sit in the chair opposite hers, the firelight playing over the harsh planes of his face, and they would simply share the silence. It was a comfortable silence now, not an empty one. One night, he arrived later than usual. There was a new tension in him, a tightly coiled anger that seemed to make the room even colder. He paced before the fire, his movements restless, agitated. "What is it?" she asked softly. He stopped and looked at her, his eyes like chips of flint. "Your father has arrived at the capital." Alara's blood ran cold. Fenris. Here. The past she thought she had left behind had come hunting for her. "Why?" she breathed. "He petitioned my counsel," Kalen said, his voice laced with contempt. "He claims I have stolen his daughter, a poor, infirm creature for some dark purpose. He demands your return." The old shame washed over her. A poor, infirm creature. Her father's words, echoing in the king's mouth. She lowered her head, the familiar weight of her own worthlessness settling back onto her shoulders. Perhaps he is right, she whispered. I should not be here. Do not. Kaelin's voice was sharp, cutting through her self-pity. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and knelt before her wheelchair, forcing her to look at him. His cold hands came up to cup her face, his grip firm but not painful. Do not let his poison back into your mind. He is the broken one, Ilara, not you. His proximity was overwhelming. The chill from his skin was a stark contrast to the sudden, fierce heat blooming in her chest. His thumb stroked her cheeks, and she saw a battle waging in his eyes, a flicker of some powerful, restrained emotion. The next day, he convened the court. Ilara was seated on a small cushioned dais just to the side of his throne, a place of honor that sent shockwaves of whispers through the assembled nobles. Her father stood in the center of the great hall, his face a mixture of arrogance and unease. King Kaelin, Fenris began, his voice ringing with false concern. I come only as a father, worried for his only child. She is fragile. This court, this power, it is no place for her. Allow me to take her home, where she can be properly cared for. Kaelin listened, his face an unreadable mask of ice. When Fenris was finished, a heavy silence fell. The king's gaze swept over the court, then landed on Ilara. He gave her a look that was both a question and a promise. Then he turned his attention back to her father. Your concern is noted, Fenris, Kaelin said, his voice deceptively mild. But you seem to be mistaken. Your daughter is not fragile. He rose from his throne, a towering, intimidating figure. She has more strength in her spirit than you have in your entire body. He descended the steps, his boots echoing on the stone floor. He stopped directly in front of Fenris. You cast her out, Kaelin stated, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. You left her to rot in a hovel, calling her a curse. Now, because she has my favor, you see her as a prize to be reclaimed. He leaned in closer. She is not a prize. She is not a curse. She is my guest. And you, he finished, his voice turning to steel, are no longer welcome in my city. You will leave by sunset and never return. The public declaration was like a physical blow. Fenris staggered back, his face ashen. The court erupted in murmurs. Kaelin had not just dismissed a petition. He had publicly validated Ilara and utterly destroyed her father's standing. He had chosen her over one of his own betas. That night, the tension in her chambers was different. It was charged, electric. He came to her, the events of the day hanging unspoken between them. Why? She finally asked, her voice stronger than it had ever been. Why do this for me? You said this was for your benefit. What benefit do I provide that is worth alienating your own counsel, your own betas? He looked at the fire, his jaw tight. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw, stripped of all its royal authority. There is a curse on my bloodline, an old magic, my strength, my power over ice and winter. It comes at a cost. It generates a cold that consumes from within. It has been growing stronger for centuries. One day it will freeze my heart and I will become a statue of ice. He turned to face her, and the vulnerability in his eyes was a wound. My ancestors sought to fight it with fire magic, with healers, with everything. Nothing worked. It devours heat. It devours life. For the last 100 years, I have not felt warmth. Not true warmth. My own fire barely keeps the ice at bay. He took a step closer. The day I found you in the snow, when I touched you, for the first time in a century, I felt something. A flicker. A tiny spark of heat that the winter in my blood could not immediately extinguish. He looked down at his own hands, flexing his fingers. You are an anomaly. Ilara, a mystery. Having you near, it lessens the chill. It doesn't stop it, but it slows the advance. I do not understand it, but I cannot let it go. The truth of it settled over her, vast and terrifying and wonderful all at once. She was his shield, his medicine. Her presence was his respite. It wasn't pity that made him choose her. It was need, a desperate, primal need that mirrored her own. The threat was no longer abstract. It had a name, the curse, and it was a death sentence. She watched him now with new eyes, seeing the subtle signs of his struggle. The way he would sometimes clench his fist, his knuckles turning white, as if fighting off a wave of cold. The faint, almost invisible sheen of frost that would sometimes dust his hair when he thought she wasn't looking. The curse was progressing. Their time was running out. The winter deepened outside the castle walls, a mirror of the war raging inside its king. The nights grew longer, the days colder. Kaelin's visits became less about solace and more about a desperate, silent struggle. Ilara could feel the change in him. The chill he radiated was sharper now, more aggressive. The brief moments of quiet companionship were fractured by his sudden bouts of pain, moments where he would go rigid, his breath misting heavily in the air as he fought back the encroaching ice. She felt utterly helpless. She would stoke the fire higher, bring him heated wine, wrap her own blankets around his shoulders, but it was like throwing pebbles into a frozen ocean. The warmth was swallowed instantly by the immense cold he carried. Yet, she did not stop trying. Her attempts were small, futile gestures, but they were all she had. They were her way of fighting alongside him. One night, the air in the castle grew heavy, unnaturally still. The fires in the hearths seemed to shrink, their flames burning low and blue. Outside, the wind did not howl. It moaned, a low, mournful sound that vibrated through the stone. Ilara felt a prickle of dread on her skin. This was different. This was wrong. Kaelin arrived in her chambers not long after dusk. He looked exhausted, his face drawn and pale beneath his tanned skin. He moved stiffly, as if his own joints were beginning to freeze. He didn't speak, just collapsed into the large chair by the fire, his head falling back against the high leather. "Kaelin," she whispered, wheeling her chair closer. He opened his eyes. They were no longer clear ice. They were clouded, like a frozen lake surface. "It's worse tonight," he rasped, his voice rough. A visible plume of white mist escaped his lips. Panic seized her. The cold pouring off him was no longer a passive aura. It was an active force, a palpable wave of energy that sucked the heat from the room. The temperature plummeted. Frost began to spiderweb across the window panes. "I will get the healers," she said, turning her chair. "No," he commanded, his voice weak but firm. "They cannot help. They will only freeze." As he spoke, a violent tremor racked his body. He cried out, a raw, agonized sound, and clutched at his chest. Ilara watched in horror, as a layer of crystalline frost bloomed across the black leather of his tunic, spreading from his heart. The curse was breaking free. He collapsed from the chair, falling to his knees on the stone floor. The cold intensified, becoming a physical pressure. It pushed against her, trying to force her away. The fur rug at his knees stiffened, freezing solid. The very air began to crystallize into glittering dust. Guards, alerted by the sound, appeared at the doorway. "Your Majesty," one shouted, taking a step inside. He was thrown back as if he had hit a solid wall, the unnatural cold a physical barrier. "Stay back," another guard yelled, his face pale with terror. Kaelin looked at her, his eyes pleading. The ice was crawling up his neck now, tracing the strong line of his jaw. "Go, Ilara," he whispered, his words freezing in the air. "Save yourself, please." Run? Save herself? The words were meaningless. A lifetime of being told she was a burden, a thing to be protected or discarded, flashed through her mind. All her life, she had been passive, a recipient of fate. Not anymore. She saw the man who had lifted her from the mud, the man who had defended her, honored her, and looked at her not as a cripple, but as a mystery. The man who was dying in front of her. A defiant rage, hot and fierce, burned through her fear. She would not let this happen. She would not lose him. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she pushed herself out of her wheelchair, tumbling onto the freezing floor. The shock of the cold was excruciating, but she ignored it. She began to drag herself across the stone, her arms shaking with the effort. Her useless legs were a dead weight behind her. It was the crawl of the helpless, the desperate. But in her heart, she had never felt more powerful. "My lady, get away from him!" The guard captain shouted from the doorway, his voice filled with panic. "The cold! It will kill you!" She reached Kalen's side. He was barely conscious, his breathing a shallow, rattling whisper. She glared back at the shimmering wall of cold that separated them from the world, at the terrified faces of the guards. She wasn't speaking to them. She was speaking to the curse, to the death that had come to claim him. "One more step," she warned, her voice a low, guttural snarl she didn't recognize as her own, "and I'll kill you." Through the haze of his agony, Kalen heard her. The faintest ghost of a smile touched his frozen lips. He took one shuddering, impossible breath, and then another. He was fighting. For her. That was all she needed. She would fight for him. She reached out, her hands trembling, and placed them flat against his chest, right over the epicenter of the spreading ice. The cold was an agony beyond description. It was not the absence of heat, it was a living entity, a devouring hunger. It burned her skin like acid, sinking its frozen teeth deep into her flesh, trying to freeze her from the outside in. Every instinct screamed at her to pull away, to save herself. She refused. She closed her eyes, shutting out the freezing room, the panicked shouts, the sight of the man she was, the man she loved, dying beneath her hands. She didn't focus on the pain. She focused on the one thing that had defied the cold before, that tiny, persistent spark of warmth she felt whenever he was near. She chased that feeling. She nurtured it. She poured all of her will, all of her desperation, all of her fierce, protective rage into it. She thought of his quiet kindness, of the safety she felt in his presence, of the way his icy eyes would soften when he looked at her. Love. It wasn't a gentle, poetic notion. It was a furnace. It was a forge. It was the defiant, roaring fire of her soul refusing to be extinguished. And her soul answered. The warmth in her chest didn't just flare, it detonated. A torrent of pure, golden energy erupted from her hands. It was not a gentle heat. It was a sun, a wave of fire, visible and brilliant, poured from her palms into Kalen's body. The frost on his tunic didn't melt. It vaporized with a hiss. The unnatural cold in the room shattered like glass. The guards at the door cried out in shock as a wave of heat washed over them. Outside the castle, the moaning wind shrieked as if in pain, and the oppressive, magical blizzard that had descended upon the citadel dissipated in an instant. The power was terrifying. It surged through her, a wild, untamed river of light and heat. It flowed into Kalen, not just warming him, but waging war against the ancient curse in his blood. He arched his back, a cry torn from his throat that was half agony and half ecstatic relief. The ice fought back, but it was no match for the raw, primal fire of a soul awakened. But the fire wasn't only flowing out, it was flowing in. The raging energy flooded her own body, seeking out the cold, the deadness. It surged down her spine, into her hips, and poured into her legs. Sensation returned like a lightning strike. It wasn't gentle. It was a symphony of agony, A billion needles of fire, the shock of nerves waking after a lifetime of slumber. The pain was so intense it nearly made her black out, but she held on, her hands still pressed to his chest, the circuit of their shared salvation unbroken. She felt muscles contract, tendons pull, life returning to limbs that had been nothing but dead weight. Strength, fierce and new, flooded her. Through a haze of tears, whether from pain or joy she couldn't tell, she saw the last of the frost recede from Kalen's face. His breathing was evening out, growing stronger. The unnatural pallor of his skin was being replaced by a healthy flush. The torrent of power began to ebb, leaving her shaking and utterly drained. She felt a shift beneath her, a change in her own center of gravity. Instinctively, she pushed. Not with her arms, but with her legs. Her knees straightened. Her feet found purchase on the stone floor. Trembling violently, swaying like a newborn fawn, she pushed herself up. She was standing. She stood over him, the impossible, miraculous feeling of the solid floor beneath her feet, a revelation that shook her to her core. She was weak. She was shaking, but she was whole. As the last of the curse in his blood burned away into nothing more than a memory of steam, she stood. The room was warm and blessedly silent. The fire in the hearth crackled merrily, as if celebrating. Elara stood on trembling legs, her gaze fixed on the man lying on the floor. He was breathing deeply, peacefully. The war was over. His eyelids fluttered, then opened. He looked up, his gaze finding her immediately. The clouded ice was gone. His eyes were a clear, deep gray, like a calm sea after a storm. He saw her standing above him, silhouetted by the firelight. There was no shock on his face, no surprise. Only a deep, profound recognition, as if he were seeing something he had been waiting for his entire life. "I knew it," he whispered, his voice hoarse but clear. "The fire to my ice." The strength that had held her up fled in an instant. Her legs gave way, buckling beneath her. She cried out, expecting to hit the hard stone, but he moved with a speed and grace she had never seen in him. He caught her, pulling her into his arms, his body strong and solid against hers. He held her, and she clung to him, burying her face in his neck. She felt the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her cheek, and she felt the warmth. For the first time, his skin was not cold. It was warm, radiantly, wonderfully warm. His touch was no longer the chill of a glacier. It was the warmth of a hearth, of a home. They knelt there on the floor, wrapped in each other's arms, the world reduced to the circle of their embrace. The guards at the door watched in stunned, reverent silence. "You stood," he murmured into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "You're warm," she sobbed in reply. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. For so long finally broke free, for so long finally broke free, earned by the fire and the ice. "I love you," he said, the words raw with the weight of centuries of loneliness. "I think I have from the moment I saw you in the snow. I knew you were my mate, my other half. But my curse, I couldn't claim you. I wouldn't condemn you to a life with a man of ice, a man who couldn't even offer you warmth." Tears streamed down her face. "You were never the curse, Kalen. You were the cure. For me." He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a king claiming his prize. It was a man, saved and whole, kissing the woman who was his salvation. It was a kiss of fire and warmth, of promises kept and a future reclaimed. The mate bond, which had been a faint, tentative thread between them, snapped into place with the force of a physical blow, a golden chain of light and power that bound their souls together for eternity. The next day, her father was brought before the throne. He was no longer Fenris the Beta, just a broken, terrified man. He saw Kalen on the throne, vibrant and alive, the chill of winter gone from him forever. And then he saw Ilara, standing beside the throne, not sitting, her hand resting on the king's arm. His mind shattered. He fell to his knees, babbling about witches and dark magic, about the bad omen he had tried to cast out. He could not comprehend the truth, that the daughter he had deemed worthless was the source of his king's salvation and the kingdom's new queen. Kaelin looked to Ilara. Justice was hers to deliver. She looked down at the man who had caused her so much pain, and she felt nothing. Not hatred, not anger, just a vast empty pity. "You were wrong about me," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing through the silent throne room. "But you were right about one thing. I am a curse to men like you." She looked at Kaelin, who nodded his assent. "You are stripped of your rank and your lands. You will be exiled to the northernmost watchtower on the glacial peaks. You will live out your days in the same cold and isolation you sentenced me to. May you find in the silence whatever peace you can." It was justice, clean and sharp, not vengeance. She was a queen now, and queens built futures. They did not dwell in the ruins of the past. 6 months passed. Spring came to the north with a vibrancy it hadn't seen in a century. The gardens of the citadel, once sparse and hardy, bloomed with an impossible profusion of life and color. The people whispered that their new fire-hearted queen had a warmth that could coax life from the very stones, and they were not wrong. Ilara walked through those gardens, her hand in Kaelin's. She still walked with a slight limp, a faint hesitation in her step. Her muscles, new to the task of walking, were still learning. The healers said it was a miracle she could stand at all, but Kaelin was always there. His warm, steadying hand was a constant presence, a promise that he would never let her fall. Her limp was not a mark of her past weakness, but a reminder of her present strength. She was no longer the shy, broken girl from the forgotten cabin. She was a queen. She sat in council meetings, her insights sharp and compassionate. She moved among her people, her genuine kindness earning her a fierce loyalty that no amount of fear could ever command. She had found her voice, her power, and her place. The self-doubt that had been her shadow for so long had burned away in the fire of her becoming. She stood on a balcony overlooking the training grounds, watching Kaelin spar with his guards. He moved with a liquid power she'd never seen before, unhindered by the internal winter that had stiffened his movements for so long. He laughed, a deep, resonant sound that carried up to her, and the sight of it, the sound of it, filled her with a profound, quiet joy. He disarmed his opponent with a flick of his wrist, then looked up, his eyes finding her instantly across the distance. He smiled. Not the ghost of a smile she had seen on his frozen lips, but a real, brilliant smile that reached his clear gray eyes and transformed his harsh features into something devastatingly beautiful. It was a smile meant only for her, and it made her heart sing. She placed a hand on her own belly, where a new life was beginning to stir. A secret she and Kaelin had been cherishing for the last few weeks. A child of ice and fire, a prince or princess who would carry the legacy of their love. Later that evening, they stood on that same balcony, watching the sun set behind the jagged peaks. The sky was painted in hues of orange and gold, the colors of fire. His arm was wrapped securely around her waist, her head resting on his shoulder. They fit together perfectly, two halves of a whole. "Are you happy, my love?" he asked softly, his lips brushing against her hair. She leaned into his warmth, into the solid strength of him. "I have never understood what that word meant until now," she confessed. "For so long I just wanted to survive. Now—" She trailed off, looking out at the peaceful kingdom spread below them. Their kingdom. She had a home, she had a family, she had a love that had defied a curse and remade the world. The girl who believed she was worthless was gone, and in her place stood a queen, loved and powerful, ready to face whatever came next. Not from a place of desperation, but from a place of unshakable strength, with her king, her mate, her other half, warm and steady by her side.